Good afternoon. My name is Emily Smith. I work as an assistant professor of history at Oklahoma Christian University, and this afternoon I will be presenting my paper entitled The Fenian Sisterhood, Ladies Landleaguers, and the Woman Suffrage Question, the Representation of Women in the Victorian Irish Press. For the purposes of brevity, I will be omitting some of the lengthier quotations in this paper and also omitting or summarizing certain sections. To facilitate a full access to the information, I will be emailing an electronic copy of this paper to the conference hosts so that my fellow participants may read it if they would like. Also, I wanted to note that I will be filming this in presentation mode so that I can keep an eye on the time. And so apologies, you'll be able to see all the slides as we go, but that was necessary to ensure that I did not run out of time. So with that out of the way, we are going to get started. Irish women often served as props in various causes, both within and outside Ireland. Regardless of the cause, the women became objects in an ideological struggle to be lauded or vilified according to the needs of the argument. This tokenization existed because stock concepts of womanhood proliferated during the Victorian era. These figures appeared frequently in newspapers and were used to support or condemn various causes according to the purview of the paper. Women in the Victorian era operated within a dichotomy of archetypes. A proper woman conformed to Victorian ideas of femininity, while a reprobate woman did not. Acknowledging class and religious differences, the ideal woman oversaw servants, tended to the children, and ensured that her home was a haven from the world. Morally superior to men, she was chaste, innocent, naive, and loving, and relied upon her husband for all worldly matters. She could support suffrage or Irish nationalism, but only so long as that support did not hinder her from carrying out her accepted roles. The reprobate woman involved herself in politics, either supporting the suffrage movement or the Irish nationalist movement to the neglect of her proper place, or engaged in criminal activities, with petty theft, prostitution, and child neglect being the most common. This woman was reprobate because she contradicted everything that an ideal woman embodied. The Irish press at home and abroad reflected these stereotypes, with some papers supporting them and others challenging them. All four papers presented a version of the ideal woman informed by the social class, political views, and religious beliefs of the individuals involved with that paper. Most papers took an ambiguous stance on women's suffrage, with the tone becoming more condemnatory as the period progressed. And the four papers are the Freeman's Journal, the Irish Standard, the Irish Republic, and the Irish Times. Reflecting its focus on nationalism, the Freeman's Journal did not outwardly support one concept of good or bad women, but included examples of women's groups considered both positive and negative, depending on the views expressed in editorials and letters. The following discussion of the Ladies' Land League, an early nationalist organization focused on land reform, illustrated this trend. The first remarks come from the Reverend McCabe, who served as the Archbishop of Dublin. Throughout his argument, he employed traditional notions of womanhood in his critique of the women and their activities. He wrote, quote, "The modesty of her daughters was the ancient glory of Ireland. Like Mary, their place was the seclusion of the home. If charity drew them out of doors, their work was done with speed, and their voices were not heard in the world's thoroughfares," end quote. In the Archbishop's time, however, quote, "matrons and virgins are called forth under the flimsy pretext of charity to take their stand on the noisy streets of public life," end quote. The women used charity as an excuse, quote, "to forget the modesty of their sex and the high goal of their womanhood, and to parade themselves before the public gaze," end quote. The Archbishop clearly targeted the Ladies' Land League in his remarks. A.M. Sullivan wrote a letter supporting the women. He insisted that politics motivated the Archbishop's vitriol and that, quote, "Catholics like myself have a right to complain when he allows his political prejudices to go so far as to cruelly wound our sisters and wives," end quote. Mr. Sullivan based his support for the women on his, quote, "hope that in all things the women of Ireland will show what is womanly, what is gentle, modest, pure, and holy," end quote. Though he strove to refute the Archbishop's cause, Mr. Sullivan shared some of his views. The Ladies' Land League defended itself by reprinting their resolutions. The first stated, quote, "We do not consider how an organization of Irish ladies formed to relieve the victims of unjust land laws can be considered unwomanly, outstepping the natural limits of their sphere of influence and duty," end quote. Another resolution asserted, quote, "We wish to protest against the unwarranted slander showered upon us by the rejected member of Tipperary and other gentlemen," end quote. Both the women and their male supporter used traditional notions of women to craft their defense. They referenced, quote, female modesty, end quote, and the virtue and charity believed to be women's, quote, natural sphere of influence and duty, end quote. The women recognized that support would come only as long as they reflected society's stereotypes. The Freeman's Journal prioritized Irish nationalism, so an ideal woman supported Irish nationalism through the fulfillment of her proper role in society. The reprobate woman stepped beyond those bounds and therefore stopped behaving as a proper woman. The Irish Republic, a nationalist paper printed in Chicago, took a similar stance, publishing letters to the editor concerning the Fenian sisterhood, an all-female offshoot of the Fenian Brotherhood. In those letters, the women discussed their plans for aiding families of imprisoned Fenian Brotherhood members. They drew upon traditional notions of femininity, combined with a zeal for Irish nationalism, to advocate support for their cause. When detractors arose, the women were not the focus of their critics. An assumed lack of zeal on the part of the women involved provided the enmity for those critical of the group. For brevity, one letter demonstrated the theme. Entitled Letter to the Fenian Sisterhood, it read in part, quote, "Gentlemen, I would wish to call the attention of the Fenian sisterhood and of all the Irish ladies throughout the United States to the condition of the families of the Irish state prisoners at the present time and to ask them as women to come forward and aid them." End quote. The author deployed traditional gender roles to advocate for Irish women's involvement in this cause. She pleaded with her audience, quote unquote, as women, which implied an unspoken assumption that those who read her letter would be moved to help because of their womanly compassion and their gender-based solidarity with the female relatives of the Fenian prisoners. She also employed two positive stereotypes about women. All women were both inherently empathetic toward suffering and innately moved to assist if provided with the opportunity, and all women shared an identical identity based upon their gender, regardless of their socioeconomic status. She emphasized the necessity of the Fenian sisterhood helping those families, referring to it as a duty, quote unquote, and disregarded any class-based socioeconomic distinctions in stating, quote, "There is not an Irish lady, rich or poor, but can do something," end quote. The paper's treatment of women's suffrage was much more negative. So for them, the proper woman was an Irish nationalist who used her natural female attributes to support the cause of Irish nationalism, and going beyond that made her a reprobate woman. The Irish Republic, though radical in matters of Irish independence, remained traditional in its views of womanhood. Women and their enfranchisement would only be possible once Ireland had achieved its independence, and even then, those advocating for women's suffrage were viewed with suspicion and derision. They were reprobate women. The ideal woman knew her place and kept to it, employing her natural feminine attributes in service to her country, but only by bestowing charity, fundraising, and contributing to various relief efforts. Her worth was bound up in her ability to advocate for the cause of Irish nationalism, and any woman who stepped outside that role lost her role as a good woman. For the Irish Standard, a good woman might or might not be a suffragette. Editorials, speeches, and comments in favor of women's suffrage appeared in several issues, along with opposing views. The paper published an editorial by noted suffragist Mrs. Fawcett, which was entitled, quote, "Women's Suffrage, English Lady Makes a Plea and Answers Some Objections," end quote, in the January 5th, 1889 issue. Ms. Fawcett demonstrated several common justifications for women's suffrage. She assured her readers that women would remain women by insisting that enfranchising women would not turn them into men. She maintained that women's special characteristics were what made them suitable for politics. Her arguments were based on women using their influence as women to enact change by electing men. She used the traditional image of a good woman to advocate for women's participation in civic life, and the Irish Standard supported those views by giving her a platform. They also published two editorials on the women's suffrage question that demonstrated the paper's shift to a more negative view of women's suffrage. The editorials were entitled, quote, "The Reformation of Politics, the Last Thing Women Should Attempt," and, quote, "New Women," end quote, or "New Woman," excuse me, end quote. And both of those editorials mocked the suffragettes, derided them, characterized them in a very negative light. And so these editorials indicated that the Irish Standard also provided a platform for negative views and sometimes saw a woman as reprobate for involving herself in matters which did not concern her. For the Irish Standard, the ideal woman matched the archetypal characteristics associated with Victorian womanhood. While initially such a woman could support women's suffrage, as time went on, this became less acceptable. Toward the end of the period, the Standard characterized supporters of women's suffrage as reprobate, in the same class as criminals. The Irish Times took a traditional view of women. Though they were initially supportive of women's suffrage, their coverage of the women's suffrage question during the Edwardian period turned decidedly negative. The ideal woman could be a wife, a mother, or a servant, provided she met the desired qualifications, primarily that of respectability. The reprobate woman typically appeared in court cases. While the Irish Times published an editorial supporting improvement in women's education, the paper also evidenced a lack of support. The paper published an editorial which discussed a meeting concerning the education of women and girls. The editorial described the participants as having, quote, the usual indiscretion of newly acquired zeal, end quote, and asserting that they, quote, advanced the position that a woman ought to receive equal technical training with a man, and then proceeded to remove, by a very imperfect kind of destructive distillation, the reasons why she should not, end quote. The author went on to insist that the women's place was in the home and that they had no need of, quote, higher mathematics and natural philosophy, except it be a few of the main laws of physical science written in a broad and popular spirit free of technicality, end quote. While they acknowledged exceptions, seeming to assent to the capabilities of some women, they nevertheless maintain that, quote, we have nothing to say to exceptional cases, though we very much doubt whether any man would not much rather marry an affectionate and simple-minded girl who was nicely brought up and moderately accomplished than be tied for life to a female genius who bored him to death with a sense of his own inferiority, end quote. The author believed, quote, female geniuses, end quote, were the exception, not the rule. Most women were or should be, quote, affectionate and simple-minded and nicely brought up, end quote, and the education they received should ensure that they remain that way. A similar ambiguity existed in the coverage of women's suffrage. The following examples presented the general trend. In a report on women's suffrage, the editor stated, quote, Sir Stafford Northcote, replying to a deputation in favor of a women's suffrage bill, doubted whether such a change in the electoral system would not render necessary greater changes than he could assent to, end quote. A previous objection published on March 19, 1889, referenced an MP's concern that making a ruling would encourage those in the House of Commons to attempt to give orders to the House of Lords. The MP's fears seemed to be motivated by his belief that endorsing women's suffrage was tantamount to giving the House of Commons power over the House of Lords. Though the Times printed Mrs. Fawcett's speech that we discussed earlier, the overall tone of the other remarks indicated that they viewed women's suffrage with skepticism or adopted a paternalistic attitude, but were at times willing to entertain suffrage arguments. In later years, the Times vilified women's suffrage supporters. Earlier in its history, the tone was more patronizing and less condemnatory. The ideal woman behaved as a proper wife and mother, or worked as a domestic servant. The reprobate woman stepped outside her traditional role by pushing for changes that would be detrimental to society or by becoming a criminal. Each paper reflected society's views of women. The Irish Standard advocated Victorian notions of proper and improper female behavior. The Irish Republic took a slightly more radical view, but for the most part, the women in its pages were praised for conforming to traditional gender roles. The Freeman's Journal focused on nationalism, and that focus influenced its depiction of women. The Irish Times likewise conformed to traditional Victorian stereotypes.